Yes, you got it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're so excited to be here. And this is a topic that I think is very near and dear to all of us here. We've lived through it probably too many times to count. But the tide has turned. Remember 10 years ago, SMB was the in thing? And probably a lot of that thanks to Marketo. Inbound leads was the way to go, and everybody wanted to sell into the SMB, get those quick deals, get the volume and velocity going. Well, again, the tide has turned on that, and now the big thing is moving upstream and selling into the enterprise. And that means a little something different to many companies. And so what we're going to talk about today is how does that happen? Because we think that many boards, many executives think that we can just declare we're moving upstream, and it happens. And for those of you who've been through that, we all know that there's a heck of a lot more to it than that. You can't just say you're moving upstream. And it happens a couple ways. Some of it is because we're declaring it, we're moving upstream because we want larger deals, we want less customer churn. And others, it kind of happens organically, where all of a sudden you find yourself, wow, we've got some big companies that are buying. We didn't expect that. Now what do we do? And so we've got some great examples here on the panel for both instances. And we're going to just talk to you more about, how do you make it happen? What do you need to watch out for so that you don't get caught unawares during this? Because it's a big transition. We also want to make sure that we answer any questions that you all have. So we're going to definitely leave some time at the end of the panel for you to come into the middle, ask any questions that you have. So jot them down, think of them as we go along. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And as we talked about, enterprise means a little bit something different to everyone, or moving upstream. Big differences. So can each one of you tell us about, what does moving upstream mean to you and to your organization, and sort of where your journey and your path from that? Do you want to get started?
Sure.
Jameson?
Jameson's over here.
Oh, sorry.
You want to start with Jameson or start with me?
No, go ahead.
That's
sorry.
vodka.
I know.
Yeah.
That is.
So I think the question was moving
Morning
upstream.
drink of choice, right?
It's all good. Moving upstream. So moving upstream to myself, to the company. So moving upstream for me is, as a professional, is taking on kind of new challenges. Kind of putting yourself out there and taking on some risks along with those challenges, those rewards that come with taking them. As a company, Okta, moving upstream in the sales lens, and you mentioned enterprise, is pursuing a market that we hadn't penetrated prior. I joined the company, we had about 20 employees and less than $1 million in revenue about 7 years ago. And it's clear, as a venture-backed technology company disrupting an enterprise, legacy enterprise market, that being identity and access, we have to go get some bigger accounts, bigger clients, because obviously the cost of developing a product and selling and marketing a product are great, and we had to make a return for those investors and obviously get success in the market to sustain ourselves. So moving up market for us was segmenting from the mid-market, as we call, that could be by revenue or by FTE size. For us, it was both, into larger accounts, which early days Okta, that was just folks that had a few thousand people, and now we're selling into organizations and providing a service to organizations that have hundreds of thousands of people. So moving upstream for us was all about taking on things we hadn't done before and not being afraid to fail. So it's worked out.
How long ago did you guys start that journey?
Pretty early. So I wasn't, I'm not a co-founder, but I joined the company, again, early sales hire. We had less than $1 million in revenue. And I recall we were actually Andreessen Horowitz's first cloud investment. Most people don't know of us still today, and that's fine. We have a lot to prove to the market. Recently an IPO last year. But on that journey becoming a iconic company, a deca-billion-dollar company disrupting I mentioned legacy space, it was always the intention to go after the enterprise. We keep redefining what enterprise is. In my world, and kind of mix that into the professional world, enterprise just selling to other businesses. And frankly, with a lot of respect, not treating one company more important or greater than another one. Just because a company has 10,000 people doesn't make them any more valuable. According to some metrics, they are, but any more valuable than a company that's got 500 people or 50 people. not necessarily about where you start, it's where you finish.
So do you have different sales teams up to different market segments?
Yeah, at Okta we've got a revenue organization. It's global, several hundred people in that. That's everything from sales development to account executives to customer success managers, renewals, et cetera. We have a team that's focused on the commercial market, from the SMB, from the startup to the scale-up, and then obviously the enterprise to the global enterprise. So we've got specialization at every rung. We don't serve one side of the market or the other.
Great, thank you. Now we can turn to Jameson. You want
Sure.
to take that question?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, Gong's been around for about a little under 2.5 years, excuse me, and then went to markets a little earlier than expected, a little under a year and a half ago. And we started with beta users that were in mid-markets and in SMB. And I don't think we had really planned to start servicing enterprise accounts, especially not this early into being an organization. And it kind of organically started happening with customers coming in the door and those conversations starting. So it wasn't with initially a lot of intention, which is good because I've been on the other side where there's the decision to go enterprise and you don't know if the product's ready and you put dev behind it, you put sales behind it, and then cross your fingers and hope it works and hope the problem looks the same. I think we've been kind of lucky that we've gotten to see organically if the problem looks the same, and in our case the problem seems to grow as you go into enterprise, so that the product market fit seems to be better. But now that looks to be more viable, we're starting to do some of the things like, hey, let's look at this and do it more intelligently. Let's start to look at segmentation and how we approach this market differently, which I think has been nice in comparison to the let's decide all of these things first, let's try to jump into it, let's go full force, because that's where we think the money is. Yeah.
Good. And so you have different sales teams for each segment?
We're just segmenting right now.
Okay,
actually.
okay.
Yeah.
So you're in the midst of it.
And where we draw the line, and I think part of it is we actually look at the number of salespeople at an organization.
Okay.
And I'm sure that line is going to continue moving, but right now it's 1,000 salespeople or above.
Great. Thank you. We'll get back to more on some of what you said. Mike.
Yeah, so we've done it very intentionally. We just released earnings 2 days ago, so it's nice to be able to speak publicly about some of these things, but we had to prove it to the market. If we were going to be a successful public company, we couldn't be the little reader, and the microphone that might not work, but we couldn't be the little reader that you plug into your phone and you see at a farmer's market. That just doesn't scale, obviously, at the size that a mid-market or an enterprise type revenue model would generate. So it's a very intentional focus for us. It has been for several years. Square's been around for 9 years, so probably about the last third of our history as a company, this has been a full force effort. I think there's a process to it. I think moving up market is literally, it's moving. It's not a move up market. I think some of the least successful attempts up market I've seen are when people say, well, we're an SMB company and now we're going to build an enterprise product. Well, good luck with that, because then you have two companies simultaneously happening at once. Because outside of just saying we're going to go attract customers, there are 4 parts to that. It's attracting the higher end customer, actually the higher end customer, it's actually maintaining the higher end customer, and then growing revenues with those customers over time, because the whole point of wanting a bigger customer, I'm assuming, is to generate more revenue per acquisition than you did on an SMB side.
Exactly. So, Jameson, something that you said was about, the different when you move up scale, is the problem the same, what you're trying to solve. And I think that's a big issue that a lot of people don't think about when they're going up to the next level or whatever that is. Are you talking to the same people? Do they have the same issues and concerns when you move upstream? Or are you looking at totally different problems that you're solving? Can your product actually solve those those problems? And there may be regulatory issues that come about in some cases. So how do you look at that and tackle that? Because I know you did it at your past company.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there's some of it is you can calculate and you can know, and I think some of it is a little bit of guesswork. I think in most cases, what gets you the taste of wanting to go to enterprise is you'll have at least one or two big customers that come in, and you're like, wow, look at how much revenue this can bring in. Look what this can do to the company. If we can get 50 more of these, how different would our world be? And I think a big question to ask is like, is the company you're talking to, are the people that came in initially as your big customers, do they look like the rest of that market, or are they very unique? And I think it's easy to say, they look like this, and this is what everybody looks like. And I mean, my password was Zenefits, where obviously the world changes completely when you start to move into large group insurance and all these other things. Problem looks similar, but a lot of buyer personas get added in. I as far as how do you do it right, I think it's just making sure you're talking to potential customers, making sure you do the research first before you put all the money behind it, and probably even looking at the customers that are making you want to go up market, and identifying, do they really look like the rest of the market, or did we find like a diamond in a rough, and the rest of it maybe we're not quite ready for yet.
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
So Garrett, what if you guys? I mean, are you going it alone in the sales team? Are there other partners that you're working really closely with in the company? Product marketing.
Sure. Yeah, by design, I mean, our company, we do identity management for the enterprise or for businesses. For those of you that don't know Okta, imagine if Microsoft and Facebook got together and maybe had a love child, and that would be Okta. We're a system that connects people to technology. So to answer the question, there is no real value to Okta without connecting to a person or technology. We act as kind of that conduit, as that layer in the stack. So that being said, there's the traditional, yes, product and sales development and engineering and sales internally at our company, but really what we see and what's the most exciting part, frankly, of our growth has been able to partner with organizations of all sizes that provide a service, a utility. I think some of the previous presentations talked to this, with the explosion of cloud and all the technologies that are out there. We're agnostic. And so we allow people to come to Okta, they connect their identity, and it helps their company get more value by connecting to people. And then as those people connect to more technologies, it starts this flywheel effect of network effects. So the short answer would be yes. We work with a multitude of partners across the technology landscape. We're a people business, right? Mm-hmm. So ultimately, we're about securing and authenticating a user's identity so they get their work done. And it puts us in a rare category, too, of being an app that people use every single day, whether they know it or don't know it, replacing technologies like passwords. So brings us into partnership with a lot of people.
Yep. So, Mike, what were the critical things that you guys had to do and change or add or do totally different as you made your journey up?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is the awareness concept of, is this business even interested in supporting enterprise or mid-market? So yeah, you have to throw out some form of foray into the market to say, yes, we're going to tackle this, whether it be you get a marquee customer first, as Jameson said, or you just start tackling a whole different prospect base. The second thing, of course, is you need to align product, because an enterprise product is a very different user experience than a consumer-driven product, which is what Square was built on, and even an SMB product where it's very often transactional, the churn is higher, but the needs are much, much less demanding. They're not as vocal. They don't have 5 million Twitter followers, following the company if something goes wrong. So there's a different cost-benefit analysis in the enterprise. So you do need the buy-in. Then, of course, it's about aligning the actual supporting resources to properly win an enterprise customer, whether it's risk, for us, that's a big one, risk and compliance, legal, finance, data security. Those things become that much more important, that much less negotiable in the higher end segment. So it's what trade-offs are you willing to make? What types of concessions are you willing to give as a small company, as a growing company? Those are sometimes very challenging decisions that have to be made from the top down, of what we're going to bend on, what we're not going to bend on. Using their legal paper versus yours. Like that's, again, it's an annoying thing, but then all of a sudden you need legal review, at 10x the volume than maybe you did when someone was willing to use your own documentation. So it's about putting all that on paper and building that strategy matrix of all the different things that need to be lined up to do it properly. And then, of course, supporting it with dollars, with activity, with knowledge, with know-how, because also as you move up in size, that customer tends to expect a higher level of understanding and expertise for you to be able to sell to them. Otherwise, they don't want to listen to you. They want to sell to someone who's used to selling to the healthcare space or the healthcare in San Francisco space or the security space and the encryption space and whatever else. So you then also have to start training people and specializing them more and more to be able to have those high-level conversations. Otherwise, very quickly, a smaller company will tend to get thrown to the side as they're not ready for us yet.
Thank you. So Jameson, you're in the midst of your journey now. So how are you assigning quotas differently? You know, how are you handling sort of more the actual day-to-day practical side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's more than the quotas differently, right? It's the whole funnel. We have to look at it a little bit differently. Like, how do we track what's coming in differently? How do we track conversion rates for those differently? How do we track buyer personas differently for these companies that look very different? So yeah, setting quotas is part of it, and changing quotas is part of it. But that's probably the last piece. I think right now we're in the point of course we have quotas set, but right now we're at the point of really making sure we measure it right, and so that we know as we continue to scale the team, right, what's sustainable, what's not, and making sure the data's there.
Good. Has anything played out differently for you, Garrett, than what you thought?
Yeah, tons of things. So we've gotten a lot of things wrong. I've gotten a lot of things wrong. You know, what's played out differently, I think just underestimating the size of the market, of what it could be of enterprise software, and just the dramatic shift in getting there, that this is always a next step, you know, in the evolution of enterprise software was to be cloud, you know, mobile first. In that what we see is, you know, being prepared for that growth. You know, you don't always invest in the right areas, I guess, without going into great specifics. I spent time in Europe as well, and I think one of the takeaways, something that probably surprised me and I got really wrong, was treating any one market as a single market is a mistake. We talk a lot about kind of the demarcation lines between separating markets into commercial and enterprise, the different teams that align to that from a sales standpoint. But just getting to know on a very local level, no matter how big the market gets or how big you get, you know, never kind of assuming you know the customer in their requirements. And so being very close, that's a hard thing to do as the market's growing and your organization's growing very fast. That's probably something we underestimate at different times. But hey, we learned a lot.
So as the market's growing, though, are you ahead of where you guys thought you would be, or is it still taking a longer time than what maybe the executive team is thinking to make the transition?
I think the health of our business, you know, milestones, setting kind of, you know, how do you know you've actually reached that destination is, and there's not a single endpoint destination we're trying to get to. We want to build a very large and enduring, mentioned iconic company that everyone, you know, uses every day. In the market size as it is today, I mean, we're a publicly traded company. You can see our financials. The market's massive, so we're probably not where we want to be 5 years from now. We're kind of chasing that version of ourselves. But certainly we've had success along the way, from the first, you know, $1 million to the IPO, to the next step is to get the company to over $1 billion in revenue, which would put us in the rare category of only 28 companies have ever done that in enterprise software. So we're not there yet, so it's something, again, to chase. But we've you know, both learned and adapted along the way.
Right.
So
Mike, what's one piece of advice that you could give people if they're facing this? What would make the biggest impact?
Well, I think there's two things there. One, the biggest advice I would say is plan every dot every I, cross every T before you start making the moves. Because to your point, Jameson, as well, about timing, you have enterprise sales cycles take forever, and they close at a much lower rate, and they tend to take much longer time to roll out. So if you're based on consumption or, you know, an as needed or as used basis, then you could be waiting a year or 2 years for those dollars. So the timing has to be absolutely right. You need the buy-in of your company, your board, your shareholders, everything, to be able to make a move like that. So do it very, very carefully. It's not as exciting as it sounds if it goes wrong. If it goes really well, you were a genius, and you'll be paid as such. And if it goes wrong, you know, the whole company goes with it. The second thing I would say is, you know, it's a really exciting place to be in the enterprise world, but it doesn't have to be true enterprise. You know, again, it's a process to move up the chain, you know, from SMB to mid-market or commercial or strategic or whatever you call it, all the way up into the Fortune 1000. But the mid-market world's a pretty exciting world too. And I think actually you said earlier, SMB used to be sexy, enterprise is sexy again. I don't know if it's ever really sexy, but like mid-market is kind of an ignored segment because it's least defined and it's kind of most amorphous, which I think lends people to kind of float in there as opposed to really targeting it. So that could be an amazing place to start to push to then test before you move into what can be like the really upper echelon of the enterprise software side or hardware.
Exactly. Good. So we have just a few minutes left and wanted to check to see if there's any questions that we have. If not, we can keep going. We can talk for days on this. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Anybody want to take that, right?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, if I understand, so from a services standpoint, through the lens of Okta, of our company, and we kind of find this whole newer market or this newer mode of computing, cloud, software service on demand, where we call it next year, creates around it a requirement for people to be specialists in a particular category, whether it's marketing technology or it's sales technology or different stacks that are out there. So how would this lend support or guidance to you as far as, I mean, watch with the folks that are replacing the technologies of 10, 20 years ago, and the systems integrators, the services organizations around that were building businesses. For us, it's neutrality. It's focus on the category versus focus on the actual specific vendor themselves. And then you see the growth and the trends. I mean, a lot of the data we collect is around behavioral patterns and usage patterns of the technologies that are out there. We actually publish a report too called Business at Work. You want to check it out. But from a services standpoint, I think that new markets create new specialties and new requirements and expertise, and you can never discount that, right? That beyond the technology, you need to have people that are practitioners and operators that can build expertise in those areas.
I know just from our services company being in consulting business, the main differences are the person, when we're dealing with a small company that can make a decision, is still the same person we want to sell to, but they don't necessarily have all of that decision-making capability. They still have to go up and see if they've got budget, if they can get it. And of course, just the time frame to get those done can take as long, but I think that's probably normal for even a product company. We just did a couple with a $4 or $5 billion company, and it took as long just in the contract process and approval process as it did the sales cycle to get the buy-in. And I think you mentioned it, that Jameson, that we have to go on their paper. They don't sign our paper, and so that adds another layer to it. Background checks that maybe you don't have to do at a really small company. Now you've got all the security pieces of it that you have to do. So any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, given the deal cycles and the longer process with these kind of enterprise deals, when you're building out an enterprise sales team to go after these kind of deals, in terms of, I guess, commissions and incentives, do you relieve the pressure on them with quarterly targets and allow them to sort of focus on a long-term deal where, obviously the goal is to land the right deal that is long-term benefit for the company?
Okay. So I would say you have to make that decision based on the financials of your company and what exactly is needed and work backwards. I think, people ask, how do you set quota? What do you set quota at? Quota is a tool to hitting your financial target. And I think if you work backwards from your financial targets of what needs to be delivered by what date, and then what needs to be in the pipeline for the next date, and you really build a rigor around that type of modeling, you very quickly can work backwards to what needs to be delivered or what needs to be in pipeline at a certain date. So a good hybrid, typically while you're building something and where you don't have those use cases or success cases yet, is start to set milestones of, build this pipeline by this date, and there's some form of commission or quota or spiff or whatever that keeps the person motivated and excited, but to your company also shows, okay, we're on track to getting either this one deal or this proof of concept or this deliverable or this whatever by this date. But hedge a lot because, again, enterprises never move fast. Enterprise turnover is terrible. Enterprise buyers are fickle. Enterprise buyers are liars, right, as well, and they don't know they're lying, right, all the time. It's just like they'll say one thing, but then it's like, oh no, I took your budget. I'm sorry, whoops. Come back next year. Or the security team doesn't have the capacity to review your application. So you have to really put layers of flexibility in there. Otherwise, again, you run out of money. And I just think be very conservative, but also be aggressive in the setting of those targets, because you don't know. You might end up with a couple of marquee customers that you never even thought you could win, but you find your product actually is incredibly popular, in those spots. So that's my philosophy on it.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Every question's cooler with an accent.
Garrett, I'm an Okta shareholder, so more upstream, please. More upstream.
We have to file disclosure.
No comment. We're in a quiet period. Yeah.
I'm rooting for you. To the panel, I'm curious. I think a big piece of enterprise selling and executing on that is having the right folks in the building, having the right team assembled. So I'm curious how you guys identified, when you came into these roles, how do you identify some of the sales disparities and gaps and challenges with selling to the enterprise? And how did you address those things?
I'm not sure I totally understood the question, to be honest with you.
This question is skills gap. in
Skills
selling to
gap,
enterprise.
talent assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I believe what the question you asked me essentially was, how do you assess like skills gap and how do I fill that before I start moving into enterprise? Is that essentially the question there?
With existing people? I think you give a lot of latitude, right? Just because I don't know if you necessarily know right off the bat. But again, from my experience, there are probably a few basic, not skills, but characteristics of really successful enterprise salespeople. It's people who can play the strategic consultant, because largely you're fitting some form of key into a lock that they want turned, and just a matter of, can this do that? And that's not always an easy answer, depending on how complicated or messy their workflow is or how complicated your product is. So someone who could truly teach and explain, someone who could speak out of both sides of their mouth, technical and sales, right? Speak to a CTO or COO or CIO and speak to a VP of sales or the buyer or procurement or whoever on the other side. Autonomy and flexibility, someone who you could just turn your back to and just know that this person is largely doing the right things with his or her time. And fourth, the person who can control deal cycle, because otherwise these things will take forever and these things will just delay and lag and drag. And so it's like, how do you test for that? It's a little bit about persistence and aggression, and at the same time about being able to truly get to the heart of why this company is potentially thinking of making that change. And I think there are hundreds of personality profiles that fit that. Company backgrounds, male, female, doesn't matter. It's a matter of being able to get to, I think, those pretty much like 80% of that's like the kernel of success, I think, in my side. But
yeah, and I don't know if this is specific at all to enterprise, but just excited by challenge. When you're making that transition, it's going to be very hard. There's going to be a bunch of things that you didn't expect that are going to be in the way, and if that doesn't motivate you and drive you, then it's going to be a challenge. I don't know if that's specific to enterprise, but to
sales.
So I'd say with this debate of enterprise, I guess the panel theme of getting to scale or getting to enterprise, we hire people that want to sell at a higher level. And we can either hire people that have been there, done that, or 25 years, and we do have people like that are specialists in that area. But I'm partial to the homegrown, hey, you're here for 4 or 5 years. You will be in the enterprise sales world from having gone through our system, which is to build enterprise salespeople. And I don't necessarily hire by, as Mike was saying, by a particular resume. It is by personality traits. And I tend to look for people that have, frankly, certainly they're risk takers. They're not afraid to fail. And people that have the desire to take on new challenges and can speak to failure. I guess specifically, though, what we look for is people that are fully immersed in it. So it's almost like an apprenticeship program whereby if you don't have this system set up today, I think a lot of folks in the room, by show of hands, are part of the sales development world. That's a fantastic breeding ground. And I heard something earlier this morning about kind of the debate of, is it generational or do people want it? Is it this millennial? I think it's all bullshit. I think people by nature want to take on new challenges and put themselves into environments that they can grow. So for us, it's our job to kind of create this predictable path and take risk out of it while acquiring skills along the way, selling at the different levels as we go, move upstream, move up market. The number one thing is knowledge. It's really the emphasis on people and giving them the skills that we think that they need to acquire versus the ones they already have on paper. So kind of taking that practical approach versus the academic approach.
Thank you. I think our time is up. So feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll be here throughout the day, as well as I think you've got some of our LinkedIn access as well, and happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.